campus learning community, we look at different themes or different topics. And this year we're looking at United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities. And so this whole symposium is based around that concept of looking at sustainable cities through different lenses, from different perspectives. Within goal number 11, there's a target 11.4, which aims to strengthen efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage. So bearing this in mind, I would like to offer this statement, recognizing Miami's original inhabitants. At Miami-Dade College, we acknowledge the indigenous peoples on whose land we stand, the Miccosukee and the Seminole tribes who remain unconquered, and the Tequesta tribe who first occupied the land that is now downtown Miami, and so represent ties to both our prehistoric and historic past. Miami-Dade College is grateful for the unique knowledge and ways of being, as well as a profound connection to our South Florida ecosystems that these indigenous tribes represent. We look forward to strengthening our relationship with both Miami's indigenous peoples as well as the natural world. Today is actually the last day of our symposium. We've had different events and things going on all week, but we still have more coming up even after this morning's presentation. So check out the chat. I believe we just left there it is. Thank you, Kristen. We have the link to the rest of the schedule for today in the LibGuide, and you can also check out some information on Earth Ethics Institute and the Institute for Civic Engagement and Democracy. So having said that, I'd like to turn it over to Alyssa, who will be introducing our speaker. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this event, which is part of the FIU Lecture Series, Sustainable Perspectives, Sustainable Living. My name is Elisa Martinez, and I am a member of the Yes Club and representative of the MDC Earth Ethic Institute, the host of this event. The Yes Club needs members like you to find creative solutions for our environmental problems. If you'd like to be part of the solution, there will be a link in the chat so you can click on it. This event is sponsored by Humanities Edge, an Andrew W. Mellon Grant sponsorship, and allows for special programming such as career workshops, writing workshops, conference, and social events. It also provides for internships, fellowships, and mentorships. The Humanities Edge program is for students who seek to go beyond the classroom and enhance their scholarship in the humanities. So you can go to humanitiesedge.fiu.edu for more information. Now, to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jennifer Veilleux. She is a professional geographer, activist, and artist. Her work centers on water security of shared rivers. She currently works on the Missouri River within the overlapping territories of the Yosheti, Shakowin, and the United States of America. Is a visiting scholar with the Pacific Northwest College of Art and a research affiliate with Florida International University School for International and Public Affairs and Institute for Environment. Veilleux's work on the geography of freshwater basins has spanned 2 decades and 4 continents, and she's published in several journals, magazines, and websites. Veilleux lives in South Dakota with the Ayintawan people on the Yankton Sioux Reservation with her 3 cats. So you may take it away, Dr. Jennifer Veilleux.
Thanks so much for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation to speak. So Sarah, I'm getting an error on the side here saying the content didn't load. So I don't know if you can see the PowerPoint. And
Yeah, this is the PowerPoint.
Okay, I just can't see it on my screen for some reason.
Oh.
So,
can everybody else see it?
I can see it.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. I wonder if it has to do with my view. I
Jen,
have it on gallery.
You could open your own PowerPoint and just go next slide, and I'll change the slides for you.
Okay. So you're on the title slide. that says water rights and water policy. Right?
Yeah, that's right. Slide one or two. Well, one.
Right, one. Okay. So this might be a little screwy, but you know, please bear with me. Thanks for your patience ahead of time. So good morning.
Do you see the slide down in the bottom
Sorry?
right corner? Do you see the slide down in the bottom right hand corner of your screen really small?
It just says content didn't load.
Oh.
So I don't know if that's a thing on my computer. But yeah, I clicked on that because it makes a big square where there were people. But anyway, we'll just try and do this. I think we'll be okay. So good morning. I'm Zooming in. Well, it's not Zoom. I'm teleconferencing in with you, or video conferencing in from the Ihanktuan territory, as the presenter or the introduction said. And I'm an hour ahead of you, so I'm a little, so my voice is still a little froggy, and I apologize. But I'm going to speak with you today about water rights and water policy, and some of the changes that are occurring globally and here domestically in the United States. Slide. So in the years that I've been looking at water, I started working on research on water in the early 2000s, and I was asking this question kind of from the outset, which is whether water is a human right or if it's something that should be considered a commodity. And over the years, there are international organizations that have stepped forward to define, ones that we look to for legal definitions, ones that we look to for understanding the global landscape, you know, including the UN and the World Trade Organization. But here's just a list of sort of some milestone moments of understanding what the attitudes toward water are from different perspectives. So, you know, you've got the water rights are recognized by the UN. This is an important one. The water rights are recognized as a human right by the UN General Assembly on 28 July 2010. But these surrounding milestones are when sort of economists, financiers, whatever you want to call them, have tried to put their label on water, which, you know, is attaching dollar signs. You know, the World Bank declaring water market growth will be $1 trillion industry, because only at that point in 2002, only about 5% of people were reliant on privatized water. The World Trade Organization has been known to state time and again that water is a tradable good and should be treated as such, to have order to how it's managed. And just in December, there is the CME group. They established the first water futures market. That made a big buzz in the news, if you noticed it, because people are saying, what's going on? We're trading water, we're near the end, whatever. Water rights have been something that has been traded in sort of a, you know, a market trading scheme in the west of the United States. Sorry, I have a cat that just jumped on me. And in California in specific. But water rights in the west of the United States are different than water rights in the east. Each state has their own particular way that they manage water rights. So we'll get into that in a little bit, but it does feed into whether water can be commodified in the US. Globally, again, it is still up to who you ask. Slide. So water policy is a rich area of scholarship and study, and it's something that we understand in the context of like a global water policy, and it's something we understand in very like domestic cases. When speaking to Americans, they can rattle off what's going on right where they're from. As I saw somebody in the chat just shared, it's kind of instant, and it's so particular to, it's place-based, right? It's very particular to region, and that has to do, one, with the way that water is managed in the US is state by state. There is no national water policy. And in some cases, it's even intrastate. It's even smaller management. You know, if you have a municipality, they're going to have their own autonomy. Like New York City, they have their own autonomy over their water. They have reservoirs upstate that they rely upon, and they have them highly secured. So the sovereignty within countries allows for water policies to be designated in a place-based nuance. And this is mostly concerned, any water policy is mostly concerned with quality, quantity, access, distribution. Those things kind of cover it. You know, how much water, when, to who, and what is the state of the water? Is it sewage? Is it gray water? Is it drinkable? So in keeping that in mind, right, there is an exception to the idea that the sovereignty of water policy falls to the country where the water is, and that is in these over 300 internationally shared waters or transboundary basins. And slide, they're distributed all over the world, as you can see in this map. The way that I tend to, as a geographer, the way that I visualize the world when I think of it is by watershed. It just makes much more sense to do things that way, because the watershed is sort of the center point of everything. It dictates where people can live. It dictates what activities can happen there. And you can't really have much of anything if you don't have water. Slide. So there are three schools of thought when it comes to water policy formation, and that comes out of types of water agreements. The three schools of thought, one here in the US is conflict, US and Canada. There's scholarship that says, and more than just the US and Canada, but this is the scholarship that I'm familiar with the most. From the 90s, people shifting from Cold War thinking to more thinking about environmental threats to humanity in security context. So there was a lot of talk in the 90s about there will be wars over water in the future. Water is the new gold. Water is the new oil. People are going to disagree. There's going to be a scarcity or whatever, that it's going to be the reason people go to war in transnational conflict. And that was a really big theme for the Department of Defense, and a lot of scholarship came out at that time, environmental security scholarship. And it's a really interesting time to look back at the scholarship because everybody's riffing off of each other. But there was one scholar that decided, okay, let's quantify this and see, is this really true? And that's Aaron Wolf, and he's at Oregon State University. So he did a quantified assessment. He's not the only person, but he did a quite well-known quantified assessment of the hotspots, right? Like the Tigris-Euphrates, the Ganges, looking at the, in Israel and Palestine. He was looking at these spaces, and he discovered, by quantifying conflict and just defining what conflict is, how many countries actually had gone to a war over water. And he found one incident in 4,000 years of history. So he posits that water agreements are based on cooperation, that when two countries share water, they're bound to come to the table and discuss it. And then the third body of work that's significant in this is hegemony, and that comes out of the University of East Anglia in the UK. And they put forward, there's a group of scholars there, that countries actually come to water agreements. Many of them are formed by coercion. And, you know, a country like the United States forcing a country like Mexico into some agreement doesn't really want. So you can advance the slide. So again, water policy, it varies by your geography. It's concerned with access, distribution, quality, and quantity. what it does is it establishes a type of management. What are we going to do with this water? Are we developing it? Are we protecting it? How are we managing it? What's the distribution? Meaning, you know, what stakeholders are going to get water, and what stakeholders are going to have to do with less. So you're, as a water manager, which I've been in this role of doing research and making suggestions on water management, even here with the tribe I live with now, you are constantly trying to look at all of these pieces, these stakeholders, as far as industry, farmers, ceremony, so cultural uses, domestic, and meaning, you know, brushing your teeth and washing your hair. So it's an important piece that then leads to management. Typically, you start with the policy, and then this is a constant changing thing. Now, there are water policies that are quite stagnant. Those are problematic. But as far as the water managers are concerned, we are always embracing these new ways of knowing the water and the new technologies in engineering the water. Unfortunately, there's another body of work that was done by a colleague of mine looking at international agreements in water policy and discovering that there was not a lot reflecting the climate change issue. So this is something that's also going to have to be taken more seriously in coming years. And of course, water policy reifies the exclusion of historically excluded communities, otherwise known as marginalized populations. Slide. So I think that this slide might be slightly out of order to the next one, but basically I want to introduce at this point in the talk that although we have a very hefty understanding of water policy between countries, you know, there's over 300 basins, there's over 500 agreements, and those are housed at Oregon State University's Transboundary Freshwater Dispute Database, which I reference here. And I know that database well because I managed it for 4 years. There's a lot of scholars that have taken that database and done various sorts of analyses on the agreements, looking for, you know, word frequency or themes to understand what are the agreements, how are they made, what's attached to them. Often with water agreements between countries, the water is not the only thing they're discussing, but the water brings everybody to the table. So this is a pretty robust understanding and area of scholarship in the academy, and so there's a lot to be learned from it. I think you can advance the slide. When we're talking about indigenous people within countries, multicultural landscapes within countries such as the United States, the international borders are recognized, right? The border between the US and Canada is pretty understood. There's checkpoints you have to go through, show a passport, and declare whatever you're taking over the border, right? It's pretty official, hard power. But inside of countries like the US and other places where there was, you know, colonization, but even inside of countries where there was never colonization, like Ethiopia, there are these groups of people that have been historically excluded. And whether they're historically excluded because they themselves didn't want to be involved, or because they just were not sort of brought into the fold of discussion of nationhood, the people that I've worked with around the world and continue to work with and that are labeled indigenous do have a sense of place. And they're connected to place, and often they have no water agreements or very thin water agreements with the country that happens to be also coexisting in the same geography. So oftentimes there's parallel universes, and they have to butt up against each other because of climate change, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But as far as I understand, internationally, there's only 1 or 2 treaties that include indigenous peoples in the treaty, recognizing that indigenous people, often it's the border, the national borders are not as important to them. Like the tribe that I live with here, they're Dakota speakers, and Dakota speakers go all the way up into Canada. And so there's communication between the people, and it doesn't really recognize that border. You can advance the slide. So I just want to point out that the UN declared the rights of Indigenous people in 2007. And there were 4 countries that initially did not ratify. They are all ratified now. But take a look at who these countries are. These are the heavily settler colonial spaces, meaning erase and replace. So you have colonial spaces like all over Latin America and Africa and parts of Asia. And then you have, and a lot of the colonization that occurred around the world at the height of what was going on with that was simply like get in and do resource extraction and maybe set up a little outpost, but it wasn't the same as coming into a space like the US and basically declaring, this is mine, it's no longer yours. You actually don't even exist. And even today in the US, when the indigenous populations are presented, they're often presented as a historical figure, you know, something from the past, something very anachronistic, and it's a lie. There are Native American people still living here and living all over the country. And so this settler colonial thing is very insidious because it replaces language. It takes over the names of things. It just sort of does some things but not every country has such an extensive need for erase and replace. You could go slide. This map just shows you where Indigenous people live around the world, and it's pretty extensive. Slide. So it's an estimated 750 million people who identify as Indigenous. So that's the same population of either the European Union or the combined populations of Canada, US, and Mexico, so the entirety of the North American, mostly the North American continent, minus that little slip. And this is important because we are often taught to speak about Indigenous peoples as marginalized. But again, I'm using this new language, which is historically excluded, because I think it's more accurate, especially considering there's 750 million people that identify as Indigenous, and you know, it's thought that there's like 2. Okay, so slide. There's a global movement going on right now in regards to water policy, and that is the rights of nature movement. Within that, there's the rights of river movement. This is being spearheaded by Indigenous folks. And what it means is that rivers, the rights of river movement is recognizing that rivers are living entities, and that in that people who live there, in that it's very place-based, have a responsibility to that river, as well as a relationship that includes reciprocity. So if you came to my other lecture, I got more in the weeds about the reciprocity and relationality, and I'm just going to sort of skim on it today. But these are core concepts: relationality, reciprocity, in how Indigenous management practices are being presented. Slide. So the 4 key elements of motivating this sort of movement of Indigenous, I mean, there's a social justice movement of Indigenous people, largely because of climate change pushing everything to the limits and everything to the borders. And where do Indigenous people live? Typically in the borderlands. So they're on the front lines of the climate change issues, not only from the perspective of the changing systems, which they're very sensitive to, living so close with the land, but also to industry, like fossil fuel industry and extraction industries in general, that are going deeper and deeper into the woods, so to speak, to get what they want. So, you know, gold mining is getting deeper and deeper into the jungles of the Amazon. Timber harvesting is getting deeper and deeper into the basin of the Congo. And it's really interesting how it's an inevitable situation, because you've got people that were living largely like traditionally, not too worried, you know, if you wanted to go out and live in that Western value world, go, but you know, you also have a home here. Now it's like, well, actually, like, we can't catch as many fish. I mean, there's tribes that I was speaking with in the Yukon basin years ago where they're salmon tribes, but because of the state of the salmon runs in the Yukon and some of the engineering on the river and the overfishing, like 1 or 2 salmon were returning in a year. And so they had to do things to improvise, like fly in salmon from other tribes. So anyway, these key elements, obviously climate change maybe should be number 1 if these were in a hierarchy, but it's also, climate change is like a collective understanding that we have been doing things that just are not sustainable as far as water policy. And it's reestablishing that relationality and reciprocity, decentering economics, basically, when it comes to water, and also, you know, sort of elevated, formalized Indigenous voice that's been coming and coming and coming. Okay, slide. Living inherent rights versus economic resource. So what is happening in this movement is that Indigenous communities are using their agency and their voice to say, okay, we need to manage this river in a different way. So essentially, for environmentalists, this is a really beautiful thing, because at the end of the day, the river is going to be well taken care of and restored. So the ecosystems will come more into balance, and everybody benefits from a healthier system, because in the worldview of many Indigenous cultures, we are not lording above an environment, but we are instead a part of, in relationship with. So we have seen, everybody has seen, and I feel that this is indisputable, but go ahead and dispute me if you really want to, that water systems exploited for economic purposes are not healthy. And the way we've engineered those systems does not necessarily reflect a natural system at all. A lot of water systems have been engineered to serve one purpose: irrigation, hydropower. And that one purpose can overshadow the other purposes of why that river has been changed. And I'm speaking of rivers here, specifically, not so much lakes. Okay, so slide. Where does the rights of nature come from? This is just a little bit of an acknowledgement that this idea that nature has personhood or should have personhood, it's legal jargon that points to the concept of inclusion rather than exclusion, of humans with the system rather than humans separate from the system. And that is a worldview of Indigenous cultures. Also, there is a fair amount of literature within a field called deep ecology. Probably, if you're into the environment at all, you've heard of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And from there was a movement of ecologists that wrote things about this. And it continues, and cultural thing too. All right, slide. So where is this happening? This is just a really, you know, quick timeline, basically from 2008 to 2020. And actually the Yurok tribe, that was, I think, formally established in 2021. Even though I think they started the process a while ago. But anyway, so you see Ecuador as putting the rights of nature into their constitution in 2008. And there's quite a few countries that follow, but Ecuador is the first. And one of the milestone ones for a lot of scholars that I know is that Waganui River rights of river in New Zealand that happened in 2017, and I'm going to get into that a little more in detail here. But the Yurok tribes Declaration of Personhood, I notice I don't put the United States of America as the country because it's not the US that did this Declaration of Personhood, it's actually the tribe. And tribes have their own separate legal system in the US because they are considered sovereign bodies within their domestic dependence, but within the context of the US, they are nations. And so this Declaration of Personhood has got certain protections over the Klamath, which is a super contentious river in the West. And it'll be interesting to see how this plays out if there is some sort of infraction against the river. But let's go a slide on New Zealand, the Wanganui River. This case study is interesting because it talks about a development of rights of river that came from the Maori people who live on this Wanganui River in cooperation with New Zealand sort of frameworks in the institutional system of the courts. And they worked with lawyers, and this came from years of working together, and the resulting language by the declaration is both in Maori language and in English. So the keeping intact the concepts, the indigenous concepts within the language of the Maori language is so important. It's, you know, it's one reason that colonial empires took language, is that it has a power, and words have power and meaning that could be, you know, one word in the Maori language might be 15 words in English or vice versa. So the result is that there are representatives of the Wanganui River that if some infraction occurs against the river, they can take someone to court. And there's one Maori person and one New Zealand government official or bureaucrat. So place names are restored, ecosystems are restored. It's a really, really great example of cooperation and some progressive thinking. Slide. So then there's, in Colombia, the Rio Trato. This is a more complex landscape. There's 90 indigenous communities that live in this river system. It's like it comes through a steep change in elevation, and the river, of course, it has cultural significance and it sustains livelihood. So there was, I think, a really big problem with mining. Gold mining in particular is really detrimental to the environment because you use acids, mercury sometimes to fix the gold, and that all spills out into the water and really just messes things up. So anyway, in 2017, the same year as New Zealand, the river was granted personhood. And again, these agreements, slide. These agreements are interesting, but we have yet to see them get brought into a court to understand how recognizing the personhood of a river will play out when it comes to infractions. So what I am working on now is this idea that taking this international diplomacy, which there's a rich body of scholarship on, as I mentioned a couple of times, and applying that to intrastate relations with cross-cultural realities. And I think, you know, in the United States, there's 574 recognized tribes, right? Federally recognized tribes doesn't mean that's the only number of tribes in the country. Many of those have land bases. Some have significant, like the people I live with have a significant land base. The Osheti in the state of South Dakota, I mean, the Cheyenne River Reservation is the same size as the state of Connecticut, I believe. I mean, we're talking about huge land-based tribes that share these waters with the US government and with each state that they're in. Some of the tribes have brokered deals with the states they live with, like the Miccosukee have done quite a good job working with the state of Florida to make agreements about releases from Lake Okeechobee into the Everglades. You know, as a result, the Everglades are healthier. But anyway, what I'm thinking is that what I've witnessed with the US government, and this is a criticism, I worked in US government outward facing, looking at foreign issues, and we were trained in cultural competency. I look at the feds that get dispatched out here to deal with the tribes, and they're the, civilian part of the Army Corps of Engineers often. And you've got National Park Service and Bureau of Land Management, but these people have zero cultural competency. It's very bad. Unless, somebody has taken it upon themselves to learn more of the cultural nuance of the tribes that they are interfacing with. There's no official training, and it shows. And so taking these international diplomacy lessons learned and applying them domestically could be a really valuable thing, because cultural competency is a big part of that. Okay, slide. So I just published a paper with an elder here, which I sent forward to Sarah before this talk, so you might have seen it. And it's about the Missouri River through the lens of an Indigenous elder. The women that I work with, where I work now, I work for a traditional women's society and the tribe. And the grandmothers in the women's society that I work with, they are involved with tribal affairs. Like one of the women I work with, the one I wrote the paper with, is the chair of the treaty committee, meaning there's a group of people within the tribe that take care of the treaty that was signed between the tribe and the US government, and make sure that there's, the US government is constantly kind of hacking away at the treaties, as you may know, and they make sure that there's, legal kind of frameworks to push back when that happens. And there's another woman that chairs the elders committee, and they weigh in culturally on a lot of things that happen with the tribe. And so the amount of information these women have to keep contained in their head at all times is really astounding. But one thing is very clear: Indigenous views in almost every community I've worked in are system based. So it's sometimes hard for Western thinkers to come out of their stovepipe discipline and say, okay, the thing I work on is connected to everything, and this is how. And it's much less likely to see scholarship on it, because outside of ecology circles, maybe, because it is such a complex, systems are so complex that getting it into, an 8-page article to publish is sort of impossible, right? If we're going to honor the complexity, there's a lot of information that needs to be included whenever we talk about one thing to connect it to a system. And water, it's impossible to work with water or consider water without considering the complexity. And fortunately, the Indigenous view is a systems view, so it folds very into water. Well, how water managers approach water is through a complex systems view, hopefully. And that's been informed by advances in how we do science, right? Returning to the Renaissance of science rather than what we've been doing, which is the stovepiping. But I want to point out that there's a beautiful marriage between Indigenous views of water management and what water managers want to do, or what an environmentalist would want to do, because water managers essentially want a healthy water system, so you have to do the least amount of engineering the water system to get it to your user. So the departure comes with the spiritual or the cultural context, the oral history part, the understanding that water has that water is a living spirit, that it has a life of its own, and that there is this relationship that has stories attached. And that's everything. It's not just water. But when a scientist comes in and they're like, okay, we're going to identify this one species of ancient corn that's drought resistant, we're going to engineer this, and then we're going to have fields of it, and maybe it fails, or I don't know, the environmental system that's supporting it is very unhealthy. And part of the reason that result comes out is because they've excised the relationship part. They've excised that recognition of sentient being part. So Western scientists, being very anti-metaphysics in any form, and even calling it metaphysics, will push that sort of way of knowing away. And in my work, I'm encouraging water managers and scientists to embrace that way of understanding, because the majority of the world sees the world that way. It's not just an indigenous viewpoint, it's basically an overall world viewpoint, and it's the minority of people that see everything as separate nodes, separate things. And, you know, again, if those practices worked for thousands of years and this new way of managing water, which is highly engineered, is failing, why not respect it? And the slide, spirituality and logic is what I just said. And you know, the question is, at the end of the day, who decides? The economists usually. And so in conclusion, what's going on with water policy and water rights right now? There's this Rights of Rivers movement. And I tried to give you some background of where that came from and the context of the setup of who's pushing for it and what is the rest of the world. But the implementation of these legal frameworks, it will be interesting to see how they play out. Transboundary basin agreements may be a good precedent for understanding intrastate domestic issues in each country with indigenous populations. And there is this shift already that's changing water culture, the whole water is life movement and attitudes toward water, but it's going to require a further cultural shift, an attitude shift. And this inclusion of indigenous voices, frameworks, and ways of knowing can be integrated, maybe not perfectly, with Western management models. The point is that there should be more inclusion of this way of knowing and experiencing the world rather than pushing it to the margins. And with that, thank you for listening. Now, for some reason, I can't see I see chats coming out, but then I can't see them.
Just before we go to questions, if I could just ask everybody, if you have your smartphone, to scan on this QR code and just fill out the quick survey about the event. It's just something that we need to do for Humanities Edge, who is the sponsor of this talk. But thank you so much, Jen, Dr. Veilleux. That was so interesting. And I think for our students who are philosophy, intro to philosophy students, we've been talking about knowledge. How do we know? And you've brought in a brand new way of knowing here. So I think that's really interesting. And now I'm going to just turn it over to Alyssa and Mike to moderate.
Thanks, sir.
Yes, I just want to say thank you so much for this presentation. I left with some new knowledge. I think it's so interesting how you were saying how the indigenous people, how they view the waters and the rivers. And I think that's so interesting because I think a lot of people have a different perspective how they see water. And somewhere in the chat, Stephen or Stephen, where he was saying that water is sacred, water is the source of life. And it's true. I don't know, there was on YouTube, there was this ad popping up about Charity Water, which is a nonprofit organization where they try to give water to places that don't have water like we do, clean water. And for them, for those people who don't even have clean water, that don't have water like, you know, like what we do, they probably view water as something so sacred and something that's just life. So thank you so much for sharing that. And if anyone else has any questions, any comments, you can share.
I just wanted to say I was able to finally find the button to open up the full chat. And I see that Mike Matthews asks, is there a connection between language, cultural diversity, and biodiversity? I would say absolutely. I wrote a piece with another FIU colleague in response to some scholarship that came out kind of simultaneous to us releasing a paper that was very similar in that we were talking about. It's so easy to reach for biodiversity and say that there's a value to that, but we don't extend the same sort of attitude toward cultural diversity. Especially in colonized systems, there is a push toward assimilation, and that becomes a value system in our brains. Not even we don't even consciously know when we adopt these ideas, I think, because they come at us from a very young age. But this whole, oh, to be included, there has to be some level of assimilation. It negates the idea that cultural diversity has value. But I would say, from a social scientist perspective, if I were to put that hat on, cultural diversity is super valuable, not only for the richness that we can experience in our human experience, but also for solutions to global challenges such as we're facing today.
Thank you. You know, when you were talking about Indigenous people and kind of different ways of knowing, I was thinking of Robin Wall Kimmerer, and in her work, how she kind of combines Indigenous knowledge with scientific knowledge. And I was wondering if you had any comments about that, or if you're familiar with her work.
I don't know the scholar. Maybe you could put the name in the chat. It
Sure.
was a little bit fuzzy, but there are scholars that include Indigenous knowledge in their writing in the sciences. Unfortunately, there's this like branch of scholarship called traditional ecological knowledge that falls within anthropology, and I say unfortunate because it tends to take Indigenous science and technology and shove it over into into a social science, and two, into its own special box. Like traditional ecological knowledge is that kind of knowledge over there, you know, and instead of having this kind of seamless integration of, oh, that's what you see over there, this is what I see, through my measurement tools, whatever they might be. And so there are scientists that are working more to do this integration. U.S. Fish and Wildlife has been successful in Alaska in integrating co-management with Indigenous people there in the fisheries. So there would be scholarship that came out of that too. And there is a general understanding in the scientific community that our way of knowing is simply Indigenous to us in a way. You know, this European formation of science that we hold like up here is just another cultural way of approaching the world.
Thank you.
That you know, that's a really interesting way of putting it. Our way of knowing is also Indigenous. Lots of people are hopping off because it is the end of the session, and I know that students have other classes, so they're hopping off. So I think I'd just like to say thank you to everybody for coming, even though we can continue talking for a few moments if there are more questions. But I also want to remind the students that if they would like to receive extra credit, they can do a 200-word reflection on this really interesting talk. There's already a link on Blackboard board for you to upload that. So just to let you know. So sorry, continue. I just wanted to say that before more people left.
And Kristen,
there is a Stephen Nesvassel that had his hand up. Sorry if I'm butchering your name.
No, you actually got it very, very close, and thank you. And I am a colleague of Professor Jacobs and Mike Matthews from the Earth Ethics Institute. And I'm very interested in the rights of nature. And I think that this is an emerging area of awareness that can be very powerful in our movement to identify and recognize nature as not just sacred as we do in our group of colleagues, but that the way that the world's legal bodies are recognizing the rights of nature is an important step to protecting them. You know, I mean, the Supreme Court of the United States recognizes some aspects of corporate administration as having rights of personhood, And why is it so easy for us to accept the idea that corporations are have rights of personhood, but not a river?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. It's definitely a very American perspective about the corporation personhood thing. I actually had a slide in there and just took it out because that's the global movement isn't really pointing to that as much as sort of like a Western face of the global movement. And the rights of nature has been, I would say, a lot of it's being controlled. The narrative is being controlled by non-Indigenous in the US right now. I'm going to be on some sort of conference, 2-day conference about it with my Indigenous colleagues the end of this month. So it is a rather like buzzy thing right now. But the corporate personhood issue is definitely a great comparison because it came out of the 1800s recognizing some railroad in California as having personhood for some reason. That's where it started with this corporate personhood thing. And the idea that in the courts, that's how you can. I don't think anybody thinks a corporation is a person. I think it's just this idea of in the courts, there'll be certain dispensations and certain ways to approach conflict or resolving conflict if the corporation is recognized as a person, and it gives them different ways to argue things, right? So I think in the same way, that's the idea of working within these colonial frameworks. What did I read the other day? It was like abolitionists still wore cotton that was picked by slaves. They couldn't escape the frameworks that they lived within, but they fought anyway. And so this idea that right now with this push is to get national governments to recognize the rights of nature, which is anti-abolitionist, right? Like it's working with the colonizer within the colonial framework to establish this thing, but that's the world we live in, that's our reality. So that's what we have to do. So I think, the question isn't so much why is one recognized and not the other, but let's, instead the assertion, let's start recognizing these rivers this way so that they can be defended in court in this way.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Do we have any more questions for Dr. Veilleux? I guess if not, thank you so much for a very interesting and informative talk.
I thought that was really interesting, and I think it gives us so much food for thought. And I have thought of this before, but it reminded me of the problem with our language as well. How intrinsic within the language is this undermining of certain groups. For instance, this language of majority versus the minority. And within that, there is this kind of hierarchy of thinking, I think, about these various social groups and the rights, I guess, that would apply then. The way that we consider, for instance, indigenous people versus non-indigenous people, whatever that means, because it's kind of like weird language anyway, but
Absolutely. Well, I have to get going to the 11 o'clock presentation. So I jump over to Zoom. But again, thank you, Sarah, for organizing this.
Jennifer Veilleux left. I think she probably got jumped off accidentally, but anyway, yeah, thank you so much for moderating. Alyssa, thank you so much for your introduction. Those of you who are still here, thank you so much for attending. I thought that was very, very enjoyable.
Thank you, Professor Jacob. What a wonderful presentation, and thank you for using all of your resources to bring these great speakers.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks, Johan. Bye, Johan. Okay.
Have a great day.
Thanks, Isabella. Thank you, Alyssa. Hey, Mike, who is coming on? Oh, Mike's gone. Stefan, are you still here? Bye, Denise. Bye, Martina. Bye.